Welcome back to the Foreign Desk with Lisa Daftari podcast. A nation divided. What else would we have expected from this presidential election other than chaos, confusion, anticipation, and lack of transparency? We are not one nation, but two, both sides believing that their path is the right one, both sides thinking that their candidate will fail us. The other candidate, rather, will fail us. Both sides thinking the other side embodies intolerance and contempt. Both sides believing the next 4 years will be better with their candidate in office. And now, both sides holding on to the notion that their candidate has won the crucial number of votes necessary to claim victory. But the one thing that unites all Americans right now is the frustration, the disappointment, the letdown, wondering where we will go from here. I don't want to wait any longer to bring in our esteemed guest, Dr. Hans Von Spakovsky, the nation's foremost expert on election law, election fraud, former member of President Trump's Election Fraud Commission, former member of the Federal Election Commission, and head of the Heritage Foundation's Election Law Reform Initiative, and probably one of the busiest people in the country right now. Welcome to the show, Hans, and thank you so much for taking the time to comb all of this out with us today.
Well, sure. Thanks, Lisa, for having me on.
To get started, all I want you to do is just walk us through what happened and where we are right now.
Well, all of the jurisdictions across the country very quickly were able to count the votes that were cast in person on Election Day and through the early voting process. But what's happened in a number of states, and as you know, we have some states outstanding, they're still counting, is that what they're working on now are the absentee ballots. Because so many officials across the country and other groups urged people to vote by mail instead of voting in person, which frankly I think was a mistake, there was an exponential increase in absentee ballots. It went from a very small percentage of the electorate to an overwhelming percentage of the electorate. And absentee ballots take a lot longer to handle. It takes longer to process them and then count them. And that's why apparently we're getting delays. We've also had unexplained things, frankly, of major jurisdictions shutting down and not counting. I've never seen that happen. I was a county election official in two different states, Virginia and Georgia, and we never shut down or stopped counting. We kept going. We had reserve teams in place. We kept going until we had counted all of the ballots. And I really haven't gotten a good explanation for why they're doing that.
Yeah, and legally speaking, are they allowed to just stop arbitrarily?
Well, I don't think there's any law governing this, but it's just bad practice. And it not only does it delay election results, it raises questions in people's eyes about, well, what exactly is going on? That and the way some jurisdictions like Philadelphia and Detroit have broken the law by banning poll watchers and observers from watching what they're doing, at least from one side, and that's the Republican side. That also, I think, raises a lot of questions in people's minds because they're going, well, what are they trying to hide? Why aren't they letting observers in as they're legally required to do under state law?
Right. And then, what other types of fraud are we? It's funny to say that we have to sit here and list the types of fraud, but I mean, explain to people, I didn't want to show any of this because I know there are clips circulating on social media about ballots being burned, ballots being tossed into the garbage, people being told allegedly to fill in their ballots with permanent marker. I mean, to what extent have you seen this? To what extent is it true? And describe for us some of the scenarios that are happening.
Well, look, in the 2 or 3 months leading up to the general election, there were cases in different parts of the country of individuals being charged with election fraud. In Texas, for example, they arrested 5 people in 2 different cases involving absentee ballot fraud in recent elections. In Philadelphia itself, where we're still waiting for the counting to be done. Just about a month ago, a former Democratic congressman who's now a political consultant was indicted by the U.S. attorney for bribing election officials in Philadelphia to stuff the ballot box in polling places with fraudulent ballots. So we've seen that kind of fraud going on. The biggest concern that I've got with this election, in addition to the fact that they're not letting observers in, is the fact that we have states like North Carolina and Pennsylvania, which are still outstanding. We had organizations and entities there other than the state legislature changing the rules.
Wow.
Governing absentee ballots, frankly, in the middle of the election, and also when they don't have the legal authority to do that. As you know, in Pennsylvania, the state Supreme Court just suddenly stepped in and said, we're extending the deadline for the receipt of absentee ballots. Instead of having to be received by the end of election day, they said it would be okay for them to come in up to 3 days after the election. Not only that, but they then said that even if there's not a postmark on the envelopes indicating that the person voted the ballot by the end of election day, it would have to be counted. I mean, it's changes like that that don't make a lot of sense and make you worry that absentee ballots may be collected by vote harvesters after election day.
Sure.
So they can make sure that they get counted. North Carolina did a similar thing. The State Board of Elections there, which is controlled by Democrats, simply overrode a state statute on absentee ballots and said, again, we're extending the deadline to more than a week after the election. And it's those kind of things that, like I said, raise a lot of concerns in the minds of those who want a fair and secure election process.
Which one of those states, or how many of the outstanding states, in your opinion, could have already been called or been called even election night?
Well, I think if we had had the original deadlines, for example, in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, I think they could have already called them. I think Michigan could have been called earlier, except there too, I think they stopped counting. The same thing happened in Georgia. Georgia, as you know, they still had not come up with their final result. And again, I didn't understand it. Fulton County, which is the largest county in the state, it's probably about 10% of the vote. It encompasses metropolitan Atlanta. I actually know that county well because 20 years ago, I was on the county election board. And we never, ever quit counting ballots until it was done, even if it took all night. Yet Fulton County at around 10 or 10:30 on election eve suddenly said, oh, we're not going to count any more ballots, and they put it off. I would hope, but we don't know, were poll watchers and poll observers allowed to stay in the building to keep an eye on those ballot boxes? I don't know the answer to that.
Right. Well, I'm seeing tweets talking about how a lot of those observers were asked to leave, or that they paused counting and wanted to go and legally have these observers removed from the room. Again, these are just tweets. These are not verified. I'm just telling you what I saw. Right. And we're also seeing social media platforms censor a lot of these videos, a lot of these posts, not wanting them to circulate. So it's no surprise, obviously, Hans, that President Trump's legal team has announced that they will be taking legal action. I want you to take a listen to the president's son, Eric Trump, and Rudy Giuliani talk a bit about that.
Here are just some of the top campaign officials.
We came to Pennsylvania today to meet with our legal teams. It's very clear to us, and we've declared victory in Pennsylvania. We're up by 400,000 votes, with 86% of the precincts in. 86%, and we have Republican votes still coming in from Trump country. And the Democrats know that the only way that they could win this election is to cheat in Pennsylvania. And we've seen it from day one. We've seen it from day one. We found ballots in drainage ditches. They're not letting our poll watchers watch the polls. They're not letting them inside. There's video after video of them passing out collateral material in polling sites all over Philadelphia. They're trying to cheat. They're trying to cheat. They have 3x5 printed big posters in polling locations all over the city saying to vote for Biden and Harris, which is totally illegal. They're passing out flyers. The supervisors of elections, we have them on video, certain ones wearing literally Biden-Harris face masks in polling locations, which is totally illegal. And now they won't let, and we brought one great gentleman here with us today, Jeremy, who's a poll watcher down at the convention center. They won't even let him watch as they count the ballots. They put them behind a fence 40, 50 yards away where they actually can't see the counting happening. Guys, this is fraud.
So we are going to continue the lawsuit here. We're going to bring a second one And then we're going to bring a federal lawsuit. And we're going to take a very good look at whether we bring this nationally. We certainly are going to bring it here and in Wisconsin. Quite possibly, we'll do a national lawsuit and really expose the corruption of the Democrat Party. But this is beyond anything I've ever seen before. This comes when you think you have so much power and you own the media that you can do anything you want.
Emotions are high, but it seems like the list of evidence is also pretty substantial. What's your take on the legal recourse that the president has at this point?
Well, unfortunately, it's very tough to fight an election outcome because you don't have a lot of time to do it after the election outcome, the results are finally announced. And it takes a lot of staff and resources to bring up the kind of evidence you need to do that. Despite, look, I don't doubt the claims being made in Philadelphia, for example. That's unfortunately a pattern of bad behavior that we've had in Philadelphia for years, but it's just tough to get enough evidence together to get an election overturned. So while legally, I think they're in the right. I mean, for example, keeping observers out of polling places and out of the counting process is a straight out violation of Pennsylvania law. From a practical standpoint, they've got a very uphill battle to convince judges to actually do anything about it. So it's a tough fight ahead of them to be able to change the status quo of what's going on.
So, I mean, that's disheartening. I'm sure a lot of our listeners feel the same way, particularly as there are individuals, there are people who are willing to be witnesses to say that there was foul play. Legal recourse aside, what are the chances that a state like Arizona will basically check themselves and come out by the end of the week or next week and say, we made a mistake?
The chances, unfortunately, are slim. And I know that the Trump campaign has been talking about getting a recount, for example, in Wisconsin. Let me tell you the problem with recounts. If you look at the history of recounts in elections across the country, what you find is that if there's a significant margin of victory, and I'm talking about 10,000 votes, 20,000 votes, recounts hardly ever change the outcome of the election. The only kind of elections where you see recounts making a difference is where the difference is really, really small. If it's 1,000 votes or 2,000 votes, then a recount might actually change the outcome. But you get much larger than that, and it hardly ever makes any change in the results of the election.
Now, you see a lot of people posting, 138 or so thousand votes were found. 100% of them claim to have been Biden votes. And you see, people who contest that and say, the Democrats were the ones who were pro mail-in ballots. So it makes perfect sense that all the mail-in ballots would be from Democrats. What do you say to that?
Well, what I say about that is that even if it is true that more Democrats use mail-in ballots, it's not 100% of absentee ballots are not used by Democrats. Both Republicans and Democrats, and frankly, libertarians and independents, they also use use absentee or mail-in ballots. So while I guess it's possible that 100% of the ballots coming in from one particular precinct don't have a single vote for the other candidate, that's a little hard to believe, particularly even in urban areas where the Democratic Party is very strong. When you look at the fact that President Trump actually garnered a very large share of record numbers of, for example, the Hispanic vote all across the country. He pulled in a lot of African American votes, much more than prior presidential candidates on the Republican side. So again, while I guess that's possible, it seems a bit unusual.
Yeah, and I know you've been talking about or warning against the dangers of using mail-in ballots for a long time now. And what's interesting is in the places where the COVID virus was the worst in the country. I'm talking about hotspots in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, perhaps Florida a bit later, California. Those states were fine. Those states meaning fine in the sense that they were able to get results out very quickly,
Right.
and the states that were having issues. So I want you to basically reinstate your position. I mean, were mail-in ballots necessary?
I don't think so. Anybody who voted in person in this election saw that they could do so safely, because what did election officials do? They put in all the health safety protocols that have been recommended by health experts, including the CDC. And they had line spacing for the voters. Everyone was wearing masks. The precinct I went to used disposable pens. Each voter got a disposable pen to mark their ballot. So there really wasn't any reason to vote by mail unless you are particularly in one of the groups that's really susceptible, and you have a danger from the COVID-19. That is not the vast majority of Americans who could vote safely in person without resorting to an absentee ballot.
Yeah. And you know what I love about having you on is that you didn't become this election fraud expert for the sake of this election. You've been doing this for many, many years. You have written
Right.
a book on this. You have a database basically plotting out all of the scenarios that have occurred and the potential scenarios that can occur. And those that data has strongly been criticized, obviously, by those who basically like, I guess, election fraud to happen, especially up leading to this election. I know, you put out this data and, for the sake of the nation, and, I say this in almost every podcast I do, regardless of the topic, I will still stop and say we live in the best nation on the planet. We love this country. We want to protect this country. And I wish both sides felt that way, where we can say, if something wrong happened, that affects our democracy. That affects both sides.
Right.
If you put out data, that affects both sides. That says, well, if there was some fraud, regardless of which party committed that fraud, that could happen again next time to your party. Why? I mean, this is, and I've been really digging and trying to make more sense of this in the past couple of days. But, I looked a lot at your data, and why do you think there was that backlash, or there was that criticism to your data even before this election? I mean, what were they setting up for? Why were they trying to set the precedent that someone like you was studied this inside and out and has provided plenty of evidence would be exaggerating about the potential of voter fraud this time around?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because, for example, USA Today and PBS Frontline got together and, if you can believe it, assigned 14 reporters to go through our election fraud database, which documents proven voter fraud and election fraud cases from across the country. Too bad they don't dedicate those kind of reporters to actually investigating some of the recent cases of election fraud and the people that have been indicted
Exactly
about
right.
it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's two reasons for this. One, by trying to deny that election fraud occurs, they then have an excuse for opposing any and all common sense reforms that are intended to address the vulnerability of the systems. Some states have been trying to do things like put in a voter ID requirement, which just
Right.
seems, like I said, it's just common sense. The vast majority of Americans agree, of course you should show an ID when you
Meanwhile,
vote.
now during COVID, when you go to pick up your groceries, you show ID.
Right. But by saying there's no election fraud, which is of course false, they can say, oh, see, there's no reason to put in an ID requirement. By denying that we have another problem, which is people who are not U.S. citizens easily registering and voting in elections, and there have been plenty of cases to show, unfortunately, they're doing that, they can oppose a proposed remedy, which is to say that when you register to vote, you have to provide proof of citizenship. On the other hand, there are some folks who don't want these kind of measures in place because it would make it harder for them to steal elections. And the best example of that I can give you is the New York Post published an article, I think now about 2 months ago, where they interviewed a longtime political consultant who has worked for numerous Democratic candidates, and he explained how he has easily submitted fraudulent absentee ballots in election after election over the years in New Jersey. And he talked about how easy it is and how he's never gotten caught.
Wow. Wow. I mean, and again, you'd want both sides to understand how dangerous this is, just like you'd want both sides to believe in diversity. There's a New York Times reporter this morning who said that it's devastating. I think that's the word that was used. Devastating that so many minorities voted for Donald Trump. I mean, they believe in diversity and they believe in tolerance when really all they want is this myopic view of the country. Hans, I want to take this forward a bit and ask you, if you don't think that there's any legal recourse despite the evidence, what can be done? I mean, there's so many people right now that are just so frustrated with what has happened. What can be done?
Well, I shouldn't say there's no legal recourse. I just think it may be tough, even following the potential legal remedies for some of these things that have been happening in these states to be reversed. People need to pay attention to the election process all the time, not just when we have an election occurring. Because one of the things that could have stopped a lot of the behavior we're seeing and the problems we're seeing is if state legislatures were persuaded by voters to pass things like a voter ID requirement that applies to both in-person voting and absentee ballot. If they had been persuaded to put in a law that requires proof of citizenship when you register to vote, a simple law that says when people are called for jury duty and they're excused because they're not U.S. citizens, the courts have to send that information to election officials to check and see, well, is that person registered to vote? The person who said they're not a U.S. citizen? I mean, that's a simple fix.
But Hans, I'm going to push
nobody
back.
wants to do it.
Just one, I'm going to push back, not because I don't believe in your expertise. I do. I think you're the most brilliant person on this subject, which is why I want to push back. What confidence do we have in the system to say that we can push or influence our legislators to do these things? I mean, it looks like this guy in Philadelphia is like a one-man show, the Attorney General. I mean, there's local mayors who are handling this fraud on their own.
Look, I agree that is very problematic, but that's the most I can tell folks to do, which is they've got to get involved and lobby elected representatives, elected officials to try to push in place the kind of things that we think are appropriate for solving many of these problems. And look, if they can't persuade somebody, then they need to do everything they can to make sure that person doesn't get reelected. And yeah, there may be many instances where they're not successful, but there are plenty of other times where they may be able to be successful.
So, I mean, yeah, or when they call for those donations, you can remind them then.
Yes.
Right. That seems to be the best way to do things these days. Where do we go from here, Hans?
Well, obviously, we've got to see what happens with the election. I do have to say that, it looks tentatively as if the Republicans will retain control of the Senate. It looks like the Democrats will retain control of the House. One of the reasons that's very important is that 2 years ago, in 2018, when Democrats took over the House, the very first bill that they pushed, H.R. 1, and this was sponsored by Nancy Pelosi, was a bill that would have led to a federal takeover of the election process and would have put in all these bad rules. Like, for example, they would have voided out any voter ID law anywhere in the country. So the states that have put in voter ID laws, those laws would have been voided. There were all kinds of other things in that bill that would have made it easier to cheat and easier to manipulate election results. So it's really important that we keep enough conservatives in Congress to prevent that kind of bill from getting passed.
Exactly. And what's interesting is you don't see conservatives trying to pull these kinds of or push through these kinds of legislative actions to make voting easier, less transparent. I mean, if you are a decent, smart a patriotic Democrat, and I'm hopeful there are those out there, aren't you looking at your party and thinking, how is this American? How is this democratic? Why are we trying to cheat to get to where we are? If we're saying that majority rules and we want to win an election, don't you want to do so fairly?
Yeah, I would hope that would happen, and particularly because, it's interesting. If you look at the cases in our election fraud database,
Mhm.
In many of the proven cases, it's not always one political party stealing from the other political party. And I should say it's bipartisan. We get cases for both Republicans and Democrats. But there are many cases where it's individuals within one political party stealing from people in another political party, particularly during primary elections.
Right. And because of what you just said, now apply that to this election. Where did this start going wrong?
Well, it started going wrong earlier this year when an unprecedented number of lawsuits were filed by the progressive left and the DNC and all their political allies to try to force states to change the rules governing absentee ballot.
Mm-hmm.
And what they were seeking in all of these different lawsuits was very similar. They didn't want signature comparisons done between the absentee ballots and the signatures of voters on file. They tried to void out witness signature requirements on absentee ballots. They tried to legalize vote harvesting everywhere. About half the states make vote harvesting illegal, which is basically allowing any third-party stranger to pick up your ballot. And they tried to force states to not be able to enforce their voter ID laws. They were unfortunately successful in a number of states, including getting the absentee ballot deadline extended far past the election date. And that's how all of this got started. It's been a litigation battle in almost every single state.
This is unbelievable. This is unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable that this is 2020. It's unbelievable that there are, that there's so many outstanding issues with the ballot itself. I mean, I saw the mail-in ballot that was sent to my house, and I was surprised that you only had to sign in one place, meaning that would be so easy to basically take or steal ballots or
Right.
vote twice. In many instances, friends have told me that they received 2 ballots to their home, dead people voting. I mean, going forward, I guess I have to ask, because this is kind of something we can't go back in time. But I mean, going forward, how much of this are we going to see change or reform in some capacity?
Well, again, it depends on the state. Some states like Texas and Alabama, for example, have put in good provisions on voter ID and other security measures like that. But unfortunately, then you have states like California and New York, which have almost no security measures in place to prevent fraud from occurring. And given the political makeup of those states, the chances that any kind of reform measures like that will be put in place, there's just no chance that's going to happen.
So what's the timeline now going forward? We're still waiting on a handful of states. How do you want to go through each one and tell us how you think it's going to pan out, and when do you think the call is going to be made?
Yeah, I'm not really sure I can predict that. I believe we'll probably find out in the next couple of days who has what the election outcome is in each state, and therefore who's got enough electoral college votes to be president. What I don't know is, once we have outcomes in those states, what kind of litigation may contest those outcomes, and whether that will delay knowing who exactly is the president. Given the pace of counting, I actually think we may know by the weekend who's been declared the winner of the presidency. Like, what I don't know is whether there'll be then litigation contesting that after we know the result.
Right, and just to put that out there, both sides have said they do have their legal teams in place to sue if something should happen. But can you walk us through the path from when the announcement is made to perhaps the Supreme Court if it should get there. How does this happen? I mean, what path can be taken, and how does a decision like this get passed on to the Supreme Court?
Well, you would start off in a federal district court. You normally, the courts are going to move very quickly. I think within days to make decisions, when normally such, a regular case can take months, if not years. And then you'll see emergency appeals to the courts of appeal, and then emergency appeals to the Supreme Court, depending on who wins or who loses. Because look, all of the federal judges across the country, including the Supreme Court, are well aware that we need a determination by the time that the Electoral College meets at the beginning of December. By then, there have to be certifications in each state as to who won the election in that state, so they know which Electoral College electors are then supposed to meet at the state capitol to actually cast the votes for president. So, look, even if there is a big fight litigation-wise that delays the outcome of the race, I still think the courts will move so that we know by the beginning of December before the Electoral College meets.
Right. So meaning the case will be determined before inauguration, so that we would go into.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, and how about if we have a tie score? Would that happen? Is there a way to work out the combination so that there would be?
Well, if there's I'm not sure it's possible to get a tie score, but if there were a tie score, what that would do, I think, is simply throw the choice under the Constitution into the U.S. House of Representatives. The rule under the Constitution is that if neither candidate wins enough Electoral College votes to be president, and I think that would include a tie vote, then the U.S. House of Representatives makes the decision of who is the president. And what's interesting about that is that each state gets one vote. So what would happen in each state is the congressional representatives would get together and they have their own separate vote. And whoever gets the majority, then that state would cast its one vote for the person picked by a majority of their representatives.
Okay. I mean, there's so many takeaways from this, and I know that, again, you being the expert that you are, have been working on this for years, and you saw this, and I know we talked about this about a month or two ago. So you have been basically forecasting that this is the awful chaos that would ensue. So I know that you probably had an "I told you so" moment. But what were some of the takeaways for you after this election?
Well, one of the big takeaways is the fact that we have a problem with particularly one-party jurisdictions with election officials in those one-party jurisdictions in places like Philadelphia and Detroit, basically feeling that they can ignore the law and do whatever they want. And that's a potential problem, really, we need to fix. I mean, one of the ways I think to do that would possibly be to amend state laws to make it a criminal violation for an election official to prevent a duly qualified poll watcher from coming into a poll or where the votes are being counted. Because right now, if these election officials violate that statute, there's really not much of a recourse against them.
Right. Right. I know my producer and I were speaking before the show, and I think that the takeaway for both of us was how important local elections are on the state level, on the city level, even, in determining this. I mean, so many of the cities where we're seeing, or I should say states that we're seeing a lot of this kind of, like you mentioned, Pittsburgh and also in Wisconsin, we saw a lot of this. I mean, these are also the places where we saw a lot of the protests. Is this kind of like a referendum on the presidency? Is this, what's the connection?
Well, I do think, as all the pollsters were basically wrong, as was the mainstream media.
Right.
they had no idea how strongly the president would do and how much he appealed to so many voters. And I actually think that the violence, the rioting, the arsonists in these cities across the country, the protests, that actually may have helped the president because, as you know, it was one side tolerating this and actually encouraging it, and then you had the president up saying, "No, we can't allow this to happen." And I think that actually may have helped increase the support that the president had, and certainly surprised a lot of people on the left.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, the media had such, as you mentioned that, but the media had such a significant role, really overstepping their bounds. And, I have a personal story about this. The night in 2016, the election night when President Trump was announced the winner of that election, I was at Trump headquarters at the Hilton in New York City. And I remember seeing these reporters no longer be able to do their jobs, meaning instead of being in front of the camera reporting, they were crying in each other's laps, unable to do their jobs. And I understand, everyone has, your team doesn't win and you hope for the next 4 years, but this time around it was different. It hit them so emotionally that they were no longer able to maintain that journalism integrity, no longer able to do their work. And for 4 years, this president fought the media alone. On election night, I had 2 TVs going. One was Fox News and one was CNN. And when you were watching the CNN reporter, when it didn't look too good for Joe Biden, they were giving people such false hope at that moment, redoing the map and basically saying, well, if we remove these red states right here, and they kind of pushed together all the blue states and kind of put together a whole new map. That is so telling. These moments that I'm just describing are so telling of, the environment that the media had such a large and significant role in creating, to your point. And, I want to kind of finish off with, again, I call on you with your expertise. And I know that you work at the Heritage Foundation in order to reform election law. That is what you do day in and day out. After this election, we have so much work to do, but, basically, I want you to tell us some of the biggest challenges that this country will face, both with regards to voting laws, coming together as a nation, and really balancing this out as Americans.
Well, my biggest fear is that if liberals control the White House and Congress, they are going to void out any and all security measures that states have passed to try to remedy the vulnerabilities in the election process. I also am concerned that that will happen in the states, and particularly that a liberal Justice Department, U.S. Justice Department, headed by a very liberal Attorney General, like the prior one under Barack Obama, will actually sue states making frivolous and meritless claims under, for example, the Voting Rights Act. Claiming that, for example, having a voter ID requirement that applies equally to everybody and can be easily met is somehow discriminatory and should be thrown out as a violation of federal law. And I really worry about that because that would be going the absolute wrong direction when it comes to cleaning up our election process.
Right. Well, this is wonderful. Thank you so much, Hans Von Spakovsky. I'm sorry I always butcher your last name, but you're a superstar. Thank you for your wonderful analysis of all of this. I think we were all hoping for some better news with regards to legal recourse, but we will stay hopeful and hopefully rebuild America once again. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Lisa Daftari. To subscribe to my podcast, go to youtube.com/Lisa Daftari. To subscribe to my daily top 10 email, go to foreigndesknews.com. Thank you and see you all next time.